Our next speaker, and thank you, I see a bunch of questions coming through for Tommy. Jesus, a lot of them came through in the last 5 minutes. For Tommy, but we've got one more speaker and then we have 5 minutes for questions. So it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Eckard, hopefully online. Otherwise, Tommy, you'll be answering a lot of questions. Now, I've known Richard for longer than either of us would care to remember, from a time when we were both encouraging Australian dairy farmers to use more nitrogen fertiliser and increase their stocking rate. The naivety of youth. Richard is a professor and director of the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre at the University of Melbourne Research Centre, addressing the impacts of a changing climate on agriculture. His research focuses on carbon farming and accounting towards carbon neutral agriculture, managing extreme climate events and options for agriculture to respond to a changing climate. Richard was recently named on the Reuters list of the world's 1,000 most influential climate scientists and was appointed in 2021 as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. Richard, are you there?
Yes, thanks, John. Can you see my presentation?
We can see your presentation, and I can see a picture of you as well. So can the guys. Yep, it's good.
Great. Yes, John, we did some long drives talking about clover versus nitrogen almost, 20 years ago. We won't go into that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, just about an Australian perspective. If this had been a 12 months ago presentation, we might have had a less optimistic presentation, but it seems Australia now believes in climate change. And so we're moving forward. Tommy presented a few emissions profiles of countries, and you can see Australia has a very large industrial sector, a very large coal emission sector. So that's obviously where the dominant emissions come from in Australia. But Australian agriculture is about 14%, around about 140,000 farmers. But our land area changes quite dramatically. I did a carbon audit on a property around Alice Springs not so long ago in the centre of Australia, and the property was twice the size of the Netherlands. So to give you some idea of the size of the properties that can go from and to. But a fairly typical emissions profile for a country like Australia, where we have an extensive grain sector that does produce a lot of nitrous oxide. Turns out most of our grain farmers produce 200 grams of nitrous oxide per hectare per year, but when you multiply that by millions of hectares, you get a very large emission. So it presents us with a unique challenge. We also have a lot of that enteric fermentation from cattle in northern Australia, where the landholder has no idea where the cattle are and won't see them until they're harvested for market. So we've got a unique challenge in Australia where the number of animals in close proximity to humans is probably only about half. Now, in terms of Australian climate policy, you would know that we recently updated our commitments with the change in government. There was a 43% commitment by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Key agricultural policies would be climate active carbon neutral standard certification. So climate active is the agency that certifies businesses for their low carbon or carbon neutral status. So that is within government, and a certification that is now being actively sought by many corporations. We also have the Emission Reduction Fund, which is a kind of a strange policy in that it's money that government sets aside to buy emission reductions in a reverse auction mechanism. I'll get into that more later, but the important one for us now coming is the safeguard mechanism, which is based on our National Greenhouse Emissions Reporting Scheme, where the big emitters in Australia have to report their emissions, and then they fall under this baseline and credit scheme called the safeguard mechanism. There's also significant research that I'll come to in a moment. So the Emission Reduction Fund, it's a carbon offset scheme. Carbon credits are issued for reducing emissions or storing carbon in soils. And the original scheme, government was the sole purchaser through a 6-monthly blind reverse auction. But the moment the secondary market started operating and was in a free market, the idea of government buying up the cost curve, paying the lowest possible price, meant that no one would deal with government in a blind reverse auction. They'd rather go to the secondary market, where they get a free market price that went as high as $70 a tonne not so long ago. But participation is voluntary. Now, It's a simple carbon trading scheme where you identify a project to reduce your emissions, you register your project with government, you deliver your project, you report on your project, the whole MRV area, you claim your carbon credits for government. You can sit on them from then, or you could do two things. One, go into the reverse auction with government and sell the credit back to government, who retire it permanently against their obligations. Or you sell it to a power station or a cement manufacturer who is capped in their emissions. Now, this is how the scheme's performance has gone to date. On the left, you can see the methods available. So, for example, there's 7 agricultural methods, 2 savanna biofire methods, and the activity on the right that you can see the number of carbon credits, tons of abatement achieved in those various sectors. What you can see is that where most of our emissions come from in the bottom line, there's very little voluntary action. So it's a bit obtuse at the moment. The vegetation sector, well, they knew about this 20 years ago already. And agriculture has a number of methods that I'll detail here. So this shows you the number of methods under agriculture, the categories, the number of methods, the numbers in brackets are the number of projects registered under that method and the carbon credits, Australian carbon credit units issued. I have a notorious notoriety of having written the dietary oils for dairy cattle method and had nil participants. The fertilizer emissions method for cotton, I wrote that, and there's nil participation. So it's fairly notorious. But we always knew that those would, they were more trying to pave the way for how we could think about feeding supplements. That was more the intention. We always knew that dairy farmers would never feed oils because you pay twice as much for the energy in oil than you do for energy in grain. The one I'll bring your attention to is 370 soil carbon methods, and only one farm, once in the country in 1 year has generated 1,900 credits in that method. I think, unfortunately, my assessment is we're sitting on a massive scam there, where this coming spring, a number of farmers would get paid for soil carbon credits that were 80% determined by rainfall of 3 La Nina years in a row. And I think that I'm talking to a number of politicians about we've got to head this off at the pass because there's a lot of false promises made. Of those 370 projects, the majority are owned by one carbon aggregator company, something really not that good. The safeguard is where the action's going to come from because the previous government had the safeguard mechanism with a flat baseline. Now, anyone who knows about a baseline and credit trading system, the baseline can't stay flat. It has to decrease over time. So it originally covered emitters over 100,000. The new government is making it relevant to 25,000 tonne emitters, so that covers more than 80% of the emitters. The secondary market is then being stimulated by the fact that if you go above this dotted line on the right, you have to surrender carbon credits when you exceed the cap. Now, with a flat baseline, that created a fairly massive market in its own right. But the government now wants to make it a genuine baseline and credit where there's a 4.9% declining cap. We estimate that'll generate more than $4.6 billion worth of demand for carbon credits in the first year alone, which I'll come to in a moment because, well, the big question is they're just not available. With trade-exposed facilities, there's a proposed 2% cap on that, but it would drive, as you can imagine, that declining cap is what will drive demand for emission reductions across the economy. Now, to switch gear a little bit, I don't think that's where the action's really coming from. For agriculture, this is where the action's coming from in Australia. We are aware that these companies, these multinational companies, have all set their targets in response to the Paris Climate Agreement. And Australian agriculture is 70% export focused. So it would be more important to know by 2030, can you sell to Fonterra, to Nestle, to JBS? I've met with some of these boards where they asked me to come and tell them a couple of prominent companies there. I get into their board meeting and they say, we've set a target. Can you help us on how we're going to get there now? And you sort of think, well, shouldn't you have done it the other way around and figured out how you're going to get there and then set the target on that basis? But not. So the other one, of course, is Rabobank and National Australia Bank hold more than 50% of the agri-debt market in Australia. And they want net zero financed emissions in their loan portfolios by 2050. So that's created a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector. And I think it's fair to say that the world we were all born into has changed. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are companies, not countries. And you think of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they're bigger than half the economies in Africa. And this is where the action is, as far as I'm concerned. And this is what we in Australia should be focused on delivering. Government policy is really about putting the resources in to provide the solutions and getting overall plan. Now, I was involved in the Net Zero Australia plan, where we tried to sort of reconcile how we're going to get to net zero across the entire economy. And I dealt with the agriculture sector part of this plan. And one thing that came really clear to us is that in order for agriculture to meet its own targets, agriculture has no surplus carbon credits. No matter how many carbon credits we generate in agriculture, we will need to inset those, keep those carbon credits within the agricultural sector to maintain supply chain access by 2030. We don't have a methane-free cow. We can't reduce methane from cattle where you don't even know where they are in the Northern Territory. A recent calculation I did, if we had to plant up all the wheat land in Western Australia, and sorry, Tommy, the wheat land in Western Australia is the same size as total land under agriculture in Ireland. But if you had to plant 100% of that wheat land to medium-growing eucalyptus trees, you would give the Northwest mining industry, that's just the mining industry on the northwest coast of Western Australia, you would give them about a maximum of a 50% offset for 25 years, but you've lost your wheat industry. I guess it makes the point. There are no surplus carbon credits in agriculture if we have to maintain supply chain access. So the notion that the industrial sector can, under our safeguard mechanism, rely on the agriculture to supply all their carbon credits is quite fanciful. Climate Active is looking at a certification for agriculture specifically, and the insetting framework is out for consultation. That means that they will allow farmers to have a 10-year rolling mean on their soil carbon and tree carbon to manage the massive climate variability we see in these stocks. We think that soil carbon in a stable agricultural system in Australia is about 80% determined by rainfall. So the last 3 years of La Nina, we've had more carbon growth in soils on the eastern seaboard than the previous 5 years put together. Now, we know the red meat industry has set a target of carbon neutrality by 2030. We're seeing a subtle shift in the language as they get closer to not meeting the target, to shift it towards a climate neutral target. We're not quite sure where that'll land. But we do see most industries, particularly the dairy industry, the largest emitting industry on an area basis, still has a 30% emissions intensity target, so really does need to change. We have signed the Global Methane Pledge in Australia, and significant money is now being put into methane emissions to the Merrill programs, which is really a supplement focus and a slow release bolus focus. National Soil Carbon Challenge, trying to get the cost of measuring soil carbon down. Probably a misguided enthusiasm in the use of remote sensing at the moment in Australia that'll solve all the soil carbon measurement programs. And a carbon farming outreach program in Australia as well. Now, I put this up for a contrast. We're starting to see different commodities go carbon neutral in Australia using climate active certification. So a number of meat providers and a number of wine. I provide those two because, well, they're vastly different. For wine to be carbon neutral, 95% of the emissions are from energy consumption. So go to renewable energy and you're carbon neutral. Whereas meat, much harder. Does turn out that a number of these companies are only offsetting the 200 grams on your plate, not the actual business that generated the emissions. So it's not truly carbon neutral. To finish off, we're starting to see how this is operating in Australia. And this is happening at a supermarket level with a carbon neutral product, but also at a whole of supply chain level. These supply chains have all set their targets. They need to know how they're going to get there. And what we're seeing already happening is these suppliers are requiring farmers to do a carbon audit using our tools. We host those tools. And this generates a QR code that then gets sent through a secure transaction through to the company. And those QR codes on the right is just my way of depicting how it's operating. So if it's a sheep producer in Victoria who's supplying Coles for carbon neutral meat, Coles buys all the 8s first and then buys the 10s and then buys the 12s. Because if you're buying 25s, you need double the number of carbon credits to get your target across the line. So it actually becomes expensive for them to buy the higher emitting farmers. So we're already seeing them buying at that level. We see that that'll operate at a local level, but we also see that the entire Western Australian grains industry is operating at that level where they are touting that they are low emissions grain than the European Union. And when you are Cargill or Olam buying on the world market, you would buy the Western Australian grains in preference because it helps you meet your target with less carbon offsets. So we're already seeing that play out in Australian agriculture. Thanks very much. That's what I had to share with you.
Thanks, Richard. That was fascinating. Like I've